Why didn't they just outflank them? It's one of the most common questions I see in military history debates, whether we're talking about Crécy, Hastings, or even modern warfare. On paper, it sounds easy. Just swing around the side and crush the enemy. Video games reward it, movies glamorize it, and even some historians oversimplify it. But here's the reality: flanking is one of the hardest things to pull off in a battle. It demands coordination, discipline, and precise timing, qualities that many ancient, medieval, and even some modern armies simply don't have. And when a flanking maneuver goes wrong, it can lead to disaster. In this video, I'll break down the real world reasons why flanking isn't always possible and why it's always a gamble, not a guarantee. For simplicity, I've broken this down into a YouTube friendly numbered list. I'll draw from history, tactics, and personal experience to show you what commanders really have to deal with. And if you think I've missed a factor, I want to hear from you in the comments section below. So let's go ahead and get started with point number 1. The commander has to recognize the opportunity to flank. This should be pretty obvious, but it's important to mention. Anyone who has served knows there are some officers who avoid common sense as if it were a deadly disease, even in the current age of professionalized officer training. Many medieval, ancient, and early modern commanders did not pass any such centralized training or certification. Instead, they were appointed based on their birth or because they'd paid enough money to purchase their commission, so we can safely assume that there were plenty of these nonsensical leaders amongst them. If the commander doesn't see the opportunity to flank, then the flanking action won't happen. Even if he does see the opportunity, he needs to make sure he has the forces available, which leads us into point number 2. There have to be two viable forces. One force, preferably but not necessarily a fast-moving force such as cavalry, is needed to form the flanking element. The second force is needed to keep the enemy in position. In military terms, we call that fixing the enemy in place. Both forces need to be numerically capable of their task. If the flanking element is too small, it may be wiped out or non-impactful. If the fixing element is too small, the enemy can attack them while the flankers are moving into position and sweep them aside. Various stratagems can be used to overcome a deficit in actual numbers. For example, deception tactics can be used to either mask the approach of the flanking element or to mask the small size of the fixing element. However, even if two substantial forces are found, they both need to be commanded, which goes into point number 3. There need to be two commanders. Again, this is pretty obvious, but not always as simple as it sounds. Both forces need a commander, not just in title, but who could exercise actual command authority over their troops. This may have been a key issue in medieval battles like Crécy, where you're dealing with a command structure that was messily intertwined with social structures. To fully understand this, imagine being a Bohemian knight at Crécy. The Count of Alençon is the commander of the vanguard, but you owe your allegiance to King John of Bohemia, who's also present. Whose orders do you follow? The Count who was appointed commander for the day, or the king that you'll spend the rest of your life answering to? These were very real questions for medieval soldiers. After all, kings have a tendency to remember people who refuse to follow their commands in a less than favorable light. So finding two commanders wasn't always easy, and even if two respected, competent commanders could be found, they both had to be in sync. And this leads us to point number 4. Both commanders need to understand the army commander's overall intent. This is absolutely critical and often overlooked. For example, does the army commander actually want to initiate a battle? Or does he want to avoid battle? Maybe he just wants to threaten the enemy and make them abandon an advantageous position. Or maybe he just wants to move the enemy army along. These are key questions because battles in any era are incredibly risky ventures. The fate of a war and indeed nations can be decided in a single day. Often commanders, especially in medieval warfare, would avoid battles unless they were absolutely certain of victory or completely backed into a corner. And once the decision was made to join battle, there was a lot of work to be done beforehand. One of the most critical pieces of work was point number 5, reconnaissance, which is essential. It's difficult, if not impossible, to order a flanking maneuver if you don't know the enemy's strength and dispositions. This is often difficult since enemy forces will try to prevent your recon and intelligence units from gathering the necessary information. In modern times, we use screen lines, deception, electronic warfare, and other such strategies, but in medieval times, an army might use pickets or a vanguard element to deter recon. Even if scouts and spies did manage to locate the enemy, their information could be inaccurate or the commander might not trust their reports. Spies are often seen as deceitful, which makes some commanders less inclined to trust them. This is especially true if the spies happen to be from the local populace. While such spies blend in the easiest, their motivations and loyalties are also the most suspect. In 2006, our commander in Anbar province was convinced that every local who came to us with info was, quote, just looking for a payout and discarded all their intel out of hand. So this is obviously a problem that exists to the modern period. And this is unfortunate because local intelligence is often critical, especially when it comes to factors such as point number 6. How long is the flanking element's march route? To be effective on the attack, a flanking force should have the element of surprise. This means they need a march route that the enemy can't observe, and this includes hiding in the dust cloud generated by hundreds or thousands of feet and hooves. Often, this entails miles of marching. It may include difficult terrain such as hills, forest, or swampland, and it may also include obstacles such as rivers. Added on to this, how familiar is the flanking commander with the local terrain? Does he know the lay of the land, where the bridges and fords are, etc.? All of these factor into determining the length of the flanking march, both in terms of distance and time. It also leads us directly into point number 7. How much will the flanking maneuver tire out the troops? Soldiers and horses tire over the course of long marches. Will your force of knights still have enough energy to mount an effective attack after marching an additional 5 or 6 miles? What about 10 or 12 miles? How much combat effectiveness do they lose due to exhaustion? In modern times, we often tie this in with logistics as well. If we send a company of tanks on a 20-mile flanking maneuver, how much fuel will they have left for the attack? Will they have enough fuel to not only break through the enemy position, but also exploit that breakthrough? If the answer is no, then the flanking maneuver isn't really beneficial because the flanking force won't generate enough combat power at the point of attack. And with that, we have 7 points that need to be answered before the flanking force even sets out. If the army can check all these boxes, there are even more complicated hurdles to overcome. The first of these hurdles is point number 8. Communication on the march is vital. Communication is important because it allows the two commanders to update each other on any changes. For example, maybe the flanking force discovers that a crucial bridge is damaged, possibly slowing their march by hours. Or maybe the enemy army packs up and moves on. The army commander needs to communicate this to the flanking force, especially if the enemy army is moving in the direction that the flanking element marched in. But how do you communicate with the flanking force? Well, in medieval times, this was incredibly difficult. You had to send a rider to bring a message and hope that the rider A didn't get lost, B didn't forget or lose the message, and C actually found the flanking force commander in time for the information to be relevant and actionable. Even in modern times, communication isn't that simple. What if the enemy is jamming your radios, or what if you believe they're listening in? Could they use your radio traffic to triangulate your position and then call in artillery or airstrikes on your command post? These are all things that make communication, from ancient warfare all the way up to present day, incredibly difficult. But despite these complications, the army can't ignore communication because communication is critical for point number 9. Flanking maneuvers rely heavily on precise timing. If a flanking force arrives too early, it is much more likely to be exposed. If this occurs, the enemy might refuse their flank, or, in the worst case scenario, they might attack aggressively and destroy the flanking unit. If the flanking element arrives too late, the enemy may defeat the main body's attack beforehand, or the enemy may be given time to withdraw or strengthen their position. Even in modern times, with GPS plotted routes and synchronized clocks, coordinating two units to arrive via different routes at the same time is difficult. Now, imagine trying to do that in the Middle Ages without so much as a pocket watch. You'd better really hope that God was on your side. Even if your flanking force makes it into position on time and has good communication with the main body, you're not out of the weeds yet. In fact, The hardest part is yet to come, and that is point number 10. Coordination of the flank attack with your main effort is critical to success. In the US Army, we have Battle Drill 1 Alpha, which is a basic squad flanking maneuver. In this drill, once the flanking team begins its attack, the suppressing team needs to shift fires in front of the flanking force. This is important to avoid friendly fire while still ensuring that the enemy is suppressed and has minimal ability to respond. For medieval army, similar coordination is just as important. Ideally, you want your flanking force to attack shortly after the enemy commits to fighting the main body, preferably after the enemy reserve has been forced into action. This requires coordinating the two elements across distance, and hopefully in a way that the enemy commander either can't see or can't interpret. Friendly fire was also a major concern in the Middle Ages. Arguably, it was even harder to prevent in this period since identification relied heavily upon heraldries, which might look deceptively similar, as was the case at the Battle of Barnet. It's also worth noting that in some conflicts, nobles changed sides faster than they changed their undershirts, so last battle's friend might be this battle's foe, and this surely didn't help to clarify the situation for the soldiers on the ground. Managing all these concerns required a lot of pre-planning, communication, and control. These are things that modern militaries continue to struggle with, even in the age of instant communications, infrared markers, friendly force tracking software, etc. In the Middle Ages, not only did they lack this technology, but commanders often engaged directly in the melee. It's very hard to have battlefield awareness and direct communications and command and control when you're also trying to avoid catching a poleaxe to the face. But those are the 10 points that are necessary for a flanking force to stand a high chance of success. Important to note is that even if all these boxes are checked, flanking is still a gamble, not a guarantee. To understand the difficulties further, let's look at a historical example. And our example is from the year 1203 when the King of France, Philip Augustus, launched an offensive against King John of England's holdings in Normandy. The primary goal was to besiege and capture Chateau Gaillard, a powerful fortress that had been built by Richard the Lionheart and was positioned at a crucial location on the River Seine. King John was determined to relieve the siege, but was facing a powerful French army. He determined that the best tactic would be to conduct a flanking maneuver. The main body would initiate an attack on land, while a second force would use boats to move along the river and attack the French from the flank. On the surface, this was a brilliant maneuver. The French would be focused on defeating the land attack and would be caught by surprise from the flank or the rear by the English soldiers emerging from the river. However, it was a plan that required high-level coordination and communication between the main body and the flanking element. Unfortunately for the English, they didn't have this high-level communication or coordination, and in addition they failed to conduct adequate reconnaissance of the river itself. When the flanking element set out their boats, they found that the current was stronger than anticipated. This delayed the waterborne detachment by several hours, and I think you can see where this is leading. Unaware of the delay, William Marshal moved into position and was attacked by the full might of William de Barre's division of the French army. Outnumbered and with the waterborne force nowhere in sight, the Marshal's men were badly mauled and he was forced to retreat. A few hours later, the waterborne contingent showed up. With no communication, they were unaware that Marshal had already been forced back. They were promptly attacked by a concentrated French force and decimated in the ensuing fight. So here you can see how a flanking force that had many of the necessary elements failed spectacularly because of poor reconnaissance and communication. In the wake of this defeat, Philip Augustus went on to evict the English from all of their Norman holdings. A single poor flank attack thereby led to the downfall of an empire. For a more modern and less severe example, my platoon in Ramadi was sent to outflank a position that the insurgents were using to shoot at an infantry platoon from. We were in close radio contact with our company headquarters, but our company headquarters wasn't relaying information accurately to the infantry company headquarters, and so the platoon we were trying to help had no idea that we were maneuvering on their flank. As a result, when our gun trucks pulled up and opened fire, the gunner on a Bradley fighting vehicle got confused and fired on our position with his coaxial machine gun. Luckily, it was only the coax, not the bushmasters, so everyone managed to walk away with little more than high blood pressure and hard feelings, but this still highlights the risks inherent in any flanking action, even in modern times. But anyway, the next time you hear someone say, "Why didn't they just flank them?" you'll have some pretty good reasons as to why. Flanking isn't a simple maneuver, it's about timing, terrain, and the sheer complexity of moving two forces in concert while under pressure, often with zero visibility and poor communication. In the real world, commanders don't have mini-maps and they can't just click and drag to initiate attacks. They have to deal with tired men, muddy roads, stubborn subordinates, and sometimes no idea where the enemy even is. When flank attacks do work, they're devastating, but historically it was often too risky, too slow, or simply beyond the capabilities of the army at hand. But let me know what you think in the comments. What historical situations do you think a flanking attack could have worked in, and how did medieval commanders do it? Was it high level strategy, pure luck, or a combination of the two? If you enjoyed this breakdown, please consider checking out my videos on the Battle of Crécy or the brutal realities of medieval raiding. And as always, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.